So today we're going to be discussing the brain and the various cranial nerves. So to start off with, we're looking at brain organization, how we fit all the parts of the brain together, as well as the layers of protection that are provided to the brain and its associated blood supply. So as adults, we have four kind of main regions of the brain. We've got the brainstem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. So the brainstem, this is going to be this most inferior portion that we have. This most inferior portion that we have of the brain. And this is going to actually be continuous with the spinal cord that we can see here. So the brainstem itself is going to be composed of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Okay? We'll talk more about each of these individual components in a little bit. The cerebellum is going to be found in the inferior and posterior aspects of the cranial cavity. So sort of back and to the bottom of where your brain is sitting. The diencephalon is going to sit just on top of that brainstem. We can see that kind of right, this general region here. And this is going to include the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And then last but not least, we have the largest portion of the brain, which is the cerebrum. And this is going to be made of two hemispheres, the right and the left hemisphere. And this is going to take up the majority of the space that we have within the cranial cavity and is going to sit superiorly and sort of anteriorly within that cranial cavity. Now, the average adult brain is going to weigh approximately 1,300 grams, about 3 pounds for your average adult, although I am quite certain that there are some people who certainly have less than that. But anyhow, so that is going to be about the average size. So obviously the brain is going to be a particularly important organ, so there's going to be a good bit of protection that's going to be associated with the brain. So there's a couple of different structures and layers that we're going to have that are going to provide that protection. So our main two layers of protection are going to be the cranial bones and the meninges. So the cranial bones are obviously going to be, formed as part of the skull. And this is going to provide us with that rigid enclosure that we have for our cranial cavity where that brain is going to sit inside. This is going to give us a nice hard kind of outer protective shell to keep that soft squishy brain, protected. However, beneath that then, deep to the bones of the skull, the cranial bones, are going to be 3 layers of tissue. We've got these 3 layers of cranial meninges. And this is going to provide additional sort of protection and support to that brain tissue that's going to, again, be in between the actual skull and the brain tissue itself. Now, the outermost layer of the meninges is going to be the dura mater, which translates loosely to tough mother, which is kind of a cool name, I think. This is going to be made up of 2 individual layers. We've got our periosteal layer and our meningeal layer. So we look at this word periosteal. So peri, this prefix here, this is going to mean near or beside, all right? So this is, and then osteal, we're already seeing there osteo, osteum. This is already indicating that we're talking about bone. So this is going to be a layer that is near the bone. So periosteal layer, as you would expect, is going to be stuck or adhering to that inner surface that we have of the cranial bones. So that makes sense based on its name. Then the meningeal layer is going to be the second layer that we have. This is going to be the true external covering of the brain. Now, deep to our dura mater is going to be the arachnoid mater, and this is this thin kind of web-like membrane, which is where it gets its name, because arachnoid means spider. Right? And this sort of web-like looking membrane that we see with this particular layer is going to be how we're going to get that name. So this is going to be deep to the dura mater. And then our innermost layer is going to be the pia mater, which translates roughly to gentle mother. All right. This is going to be our innermost meningeal layer, and this is actually going to adhere directly to the actual brain surface itself. So, starting off then with our cerebrospinal fluid, which we are going to abbreviate as our CSF. Oops, sorry about that. Oh. So the cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF, this is going to be a clear, colorless liquid that's going to provide additional layer of protection that we see for the brain, as well as the spinal cord. And this is going to help to protect against both chemical and physical injuries that might occur. Now, the CSF is going to be responsible, a big kind of player as far as transportation. It's going to carry things like oxygen, glucose, and other very important substances from the blood to the nervous tissue. So this is going to be a main sort of source of circulatory a fluid is going to be is primarily coming from our CSF. And this stuff is going to be produced in the choroid plexus. And this is this network of capillaries that we're going to see. They're going to line, oops, darn it. Sorry about that. They're lining these ventricle walls that we can see here. Now, speaking of ventricles, the brain is going to contain 4 ventricles, and these are all going to be filled with CSF, and these are going to be constantly flowing. The CSF is going to be constantly flowing through these ventricles and through the central canal that we see in the spinal cord. So for the 4 ventricles of the brain that are going to be filled with the CSF, we have 2 lateral ventricles. We've got, we've got our, I guess that's our left and our right. I don't know my left and my right very well clearly. Our left and our right ventricles, these are our 2 lateral hemispheres. This counts as 1 and 2. They just get kind of lumped together as lateral ventricles, though, because how would you choose if left or right was 1 or 2? But anyway, so this is 1 and 2, all right? Now, our 3rd ventricle is going to be down here in the diencephalon, all right, hanging out kind of around the thalamus, hypothalamus, all that. And then, so this is 3, and then our 4th ventricle is going to be down here. And this is going to be this general area that's going to be between the brainstem and the cerebellum. All right. So these are going to be our 4 ventricles that are going to allow for this constant flow of cerebrospinal fluid through the brain and then also through the spinal cord later. Now, cerebrospinal fluid, looking at the direction of flow of all of this stuff, it's going to flow from, It's going to flow from our lateral ventricles through our interventricular foramina, okay, into our 3rd ventricle. So we're flowing from our ventricles 1 and 2 up here that we can see. We don't really have a great image of that there, but we're flowing from our left and right lateral ventricles there through that intervertebral foramina, into that 3rd ventricle, which we see down here. It's going to be just around here. All right. Now, from there, then that cerebrospinal fluid is going to flow through the cerebral aqueduct, which is going to be this general region right here. You can see it's a tiny little spot. Boop. Oh, darn it. And it's going to flow into our 4th ventricle. Now, CSF is going to eventually get reabsorbed back into the blood through the arachnoid villi that are going to be found in the dural venous sinus. All right. And we can see here we've got sort of a breakdown of the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid, how it's flowing from the choroid plexus where it's being produced into the various ventricles, from the lateral ventricle into the 3rd ventricle, and then into the 4th ventricle, where it then moves into the subarachnoid space, and then ultimately into the arachnoid villi of that dura venous sinus, like we said before, and eventually where it is going to get dumped back into the venous blood. It's going to head to the heart and the lungs, and then it's going to make its way back to these choroid plexuses where it'll be filtered out all over again. So, sorry about that. So then moving on then to look at the blood supply that we see for the brain, as well as the associated blood-brain barrier. So clearly the brain is a very important organ in the body, and as such it has some pretty significant energetic demands. That being said, blood is going to flow into the brain via the internal carotid arteries that we can see here, internal carotid arteries, these guys, as well as through the vertebral arteries that we can see here, these guys right here. So they are vertebral arteries, and then it's going to leave the brain, it's going to return through the jugular vein. Now, again, the brain, like we said, is a very important organ, but it's also a very energetically expensive organ. The brain is going to utilize 20% of your body's total oxygen. Despite the fact that it's relatively small on the grand scheme of things, it only takes up 2% of your body's mass, and yet, despite this, it still is going to account for 20% of your body's total oxygen usage. Now, that being said, any interruption to our oxygen supply can be very detrimental. This can result in weakening or even permanent damage or death to those poor little brain cells. So it is important to maintain good oxygen supply for this tissue here. Additionally, glucose is going to be your brain's favorite energy source. So glucose deficiency can result in mental confusion, dizziness, as well as convulsions or unconsciousness. So if you ever need an excuse to eat that extra donut, not that you need an excuse to eat donuts, but if you're ever wondering, your brain needs it. It likes glucose. This is its favorite energy source is glucose, and so it is very important. So looking then at the blood-brain barrier, because we got a lot of blood coming into the brain. We need it, right, for all of the oxygen, nutrients, waste removal, etc. that's going on. However, we don't want just any old stuff kind of getting into the brain. We need to have an extra layer of protection, and that is where this blood-brain barrier comes into play. This is there to protect brain cells from various harmful substances or pathogens that may be circulating in the blood. So our blood-brain barrier is going to be formed by these tight junctions that we see between these endothelial cells that are going to be surrounding our brain's the capillaries of the brain. Right? And this is really important because this is going to provide us a selective barrier, right? Where this is going to prevent the passage of most substances, a lot of substances, from being able to go from the blood to the brain. But because it is selective, it is going to allow things like glucose and other important molecules that the brain actually needs to be able to enter into the brain, into those cells. Now, the blood-brain barrier is very important, but it can serve as a bit of a roadblock when we talk about therapeutic drug design, right? So any sort of drug that is going to target the brain has to be able to get past this blood-brain barrier. And so this, as a result, complicates a lot of treatments for various brain disorders, as well as drug development. But again, overall, very, very important. Additionally, injury to the brain can actually result in a breakdown of our blood-brain barrier. And when this happens, this allows things that would normally not be able to enter the brain to be able to actually enter, and that can be also really problematic. So overall, it's a very important sort of structure to have. So moving on then to look at the various parts of the brain, we've got the brainstem and the reticular formation. Sorry. So starting with the brainstem. The brainstem is going to be responsible for connecting the spinal cord to the actual diencephalon as well as the cerebrum, right? And there are three major regions that are going to be making up the brainstem, right? So from the bottom up, so from inferior to superior, we've got our medulla oblongata, okay? We've got the pons, and then we've got our midbrain kind of in there, all right? Now the brainstem is going to contain ascending sensory tracts, all right? Ascending sensory tracts and descending motor tracts, all right? So descending motor tracts. This is where we're all confined within the brainstem here. And a lot of our cranial nerves that we're going to talk about at the end of this lecture are going to originate from nuclei that are actually within the brainstem. So this is going to be a pretty important structure overall, just broadly. Now, the brainstem is also where we're going to have some really crucial autonomic centers that are going to be important for regulating a wide variety of things. But this also includes things like heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure. And that being said, if you do any kind of damage to our brainstem here, this is oftentimes fatal due to the fact that we are having these, these crucial autonomic functions being regulated at this level. And so despite, again, it's a relatively small size on the grand scheme of the whole brain, this is really, really crucial for survival of the whole organism. So next we then have the medulla oblongata. Oops, sorry about that. So the medulla oblongata is going to be the most inferior portion that we have in the brainstem. All right, and this is actually going to be continuous with the actual spinal cord that we can see there. All right, so this is going to, again, contain both ascending sensory tracts and descending motor tracts, all right? Sending information to the brain for that sensory tract and away from the brain or that central nervous system through the motor tracts, all right? So again, both sensory and motor tracts. Now, the cardiovascular center is going to be found within this medulla oblongata, and this is going to help to regulate heart rate as well as blood vessel diameter. The medullary respiratory center is going to be located within the medulla oblongata, and is going to work together with the pons to help control breathing rhythm. So overall, again, we're seeing how the various components of the brainstem, specifically these autonomic sort of centers here, are going to be critical for just overall, life. Other really important functions that we see happening at the level of the medulla oblongata are going to be controlling the regulation of vomiting, as well as swallowing, sneezing, coughing, and hiccuping. All very interesting things. And the cranial nerves that we're going to have originating from the medulla oblongata are going to be cranial nerve 8, which is our vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, the cranial nerve 10 is our vagus nerve, cranial nerve 11, accessory nerve, cranial nerve 12, hypoglossal nerve. All of these are going to be originating from that medulla oblongata. So then moving on to the pons. This is going to be located superior to our medulla oblongata and is going to be anterior to the cerebellum. This is going to be a really important sort of link that we're going to have between the different parts of the brain. And this is going to be, containing various tracts. This is how we're having this linkage taking place. Now the pons is going to contain the vestibular nuclei, and these are going to be part of, playing a role in equilibrium, in the pathways for equilibrium that we have, that information moving to the brain. This is also going to contain centers for pneumotaxic and apneustic areas of the brain, of the pons, and these are going to be responsible for helping to regulate breathing. And again, this is going to work in conjunction with that medulla oblongata that we mentioned before. The cranial nerves that we have associated with the pons that are originating from that pons are going to be the trigeminal nerve, the abducens nerve, the facial nerve, and the vestibulocochlear nerve are all, again, going to have their nuclei in that pons. So we can see here is our pons. And then finally, our final portion of the brainstem is going to be the midbrain. And this is going to extend from the pons up superiorly all the way to that diencephalon. Diencephalon. Now, within this is going to be something called a tectum, which is also just basically means a roof, right? And this is going to contain these 4 rounded elevations that are called the corpora quadrigemina, all right? Which basically means the 4-bodied triplets, or the triplets of the body of the 4 triplets, of the quadruplets. Anyhow, the superior colliculi are going to coordinate movement of the head, eyes, and trunk in response to visual stimuli. And the inferior colliculi are going to coordinate movements in response to auditory stimuli. Now, we're also going to have a region called the substantia nigra. This is going to be this large, kind of darkly pigmented region that we can see here. Is our substantia nigra. This is going to be associated, this is going to play a role in motor control. And so when we see patients that have Parkinson's disease, we see a degeneration, we see a breakdown of those little neurons that are associated with our substantia nigra, causing the associated motor control issues. We're also going to see within the midbrain the red nuclei, which we can see here, these guys right here. These are going to help control our various limb movements as well as help to coordinate with the actual cerebellum. And cranial nerve 3, which is our oculomotor nerve, and our cranial nerve 4, which is the trochlear nerve, are both going to originate from the midbrain. So moving on to the cerebellum then. The cerebellum is going to be found in the inferior and posterior aspects of the cranial cavity. So it's found in the bottom back side of the cranial cavity there, and is going to be found posterior to that brainstem, so sitting behind the brainstem. It is going to consist of 2 lateral cerebral hemispheres that are going to be connected by this central region here that we call the vermis. All right, vermis. Now, the surface of our cerebellum is going to have these thin parallel folds. We can kind of see these here, right? These weird lines-looking things. These folds are called folia, right? And the outer layer of the cerebellum is, of course, going to be gray matter, and this is going to be known as the cerebellar cortex. But deep to our cerebellar cortex is going to be white matter. It's going to form kind of a tree-looking sort of pattern that we have within the cerebellum there, and this is known as the arbor vitae, which translates into tree of life. Now, the cerebellum is going to be connected to the brainstem via 3 pairs of cerebral peduncles. What a fun word. We have the superior, middle, and inferior peduncles, right? So we've got our superior, middle, and inferior peduncles there. And these are going to carry tracts to and from the cerebellum. We also then divide our cerebellum into an anterior, posterior, and flacculonodular lobes, all right? So we've got our anterior lobe here, our posterior lobe here, and this weird little bit right here, this is our third, our flacculonodular lobe. So say that 5 times fast. So there's our flacculonodular lobes, okay? So that is going to be the various structures. So looking at the function then, because this is a really critical portion of the brain, its primary function is going to be playing a role in coordination of skeletal muscle contractions during movement. And the way that this is going to work is it is going to compare the intended movement, right, the information that is coming as output from our motor cortex, right, to what's actually happening, to the actual movements that our body is achieving. And information is going to be coming from the proprioceptors. Now, the cerebellum is able to compare these two things, right, and then send any kind of corrective signals to help smooth out or refine any sort of motor output that we have. Now, the cerebellum is going to be essential for helping to maintain normal muscle tone, posture, as well as balance. And it also plays a really important role in motor learning. So things like learning to ride a bike or play an instrument or do a dance, all of these things are going to be motor learning. So it's that kind of muscle memory essentially is going to be really important at this level of the cerebellum. That being said, any sort of damage to the cerebellum can result in something called ataxia, which is going to be classified as uncoordinated or jerky movements. Other signs that you've done damage to your poor little cerebellum might include intention tremors, where you shake when you're like having the intention to do something before you've actually initiated that movement. This is going to be shaking there, as well as loss of balance and any sort of difficulty with fine motor tasks as well. We as humans have pretty sizable cerebellums, but however, we as humans move in a two-dimensional world, right? We can move forward and backwards, we can move side to side. However, various marine mammals like dolphins move about, I'm always terrible at drawing these things, move about in a three-dimensional environment. They can move front to back, side to side. I guess that's maybe, there we go. Front to back, side to side, as well as up and down. And as a result, a lot of our marine mammals have huge cerebellums in order to accommodate for this additional sort of dimension that they have to move about within. It's pretty cool. So, moving on then to the diencephalon, starting with the thalamus. So this is going to be located superior to the midbrain and is going to take up the vast majority of actually the diencephalon. We're looking at like 80% or so of the diencephalon being taken up by the thalamus. Now the thalamus is going to serve as a major relay station for for pretty much all sensory impulses, all right? Most everything is going to have to make a pit stop at the thalamus before it's able to reach that cerebral cortex. Now, the exception to this being olfaction, our sense of smell, which we'll talk about in later chapters. Olfaction is going to bypass the thalamus, and as such, it has a very unique link to memory. So memories, or smell memories, if you will, are very strongly linked to that cerebral cortex because, again, it is bypassing that thalamus, all right? Now, a thalamus is also going to contribute to motor functions, and it does this by basically transmitting information from the cerebellum to that basal nuclei. And it's also going to play an important role in consciousness and alertness as well. We next have the hypothalamus, right? So hypo means below, all right? So if it's below the thalamus, that's exactly where it's located. So the hypothalamus is located below the thalamus. So it is inferior to the thalamus, and it's actually going to form the floor as well as part of the walls of those third ventricles. Now, the hypothalamus is going to be a major player as far as our regulation of homeostasis, right? And so key functions that we see with the hypothalamus are going to be including things like the control and integration of the various autonomic nervous system, okay? It's also going to be a major player in hormone production, specifically oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, all right? We'll talk more about these in the endocrine lecture that's probably in A&P 2. So we also have the hypothalamus playing a role in helping to regulate emotions as well as behavioral pattern, and it does this via the limbic system. It's also going to contain feeding and satiety centers that are going to help to regulate your eating behavior. So whether you're feeling hungry or full is all going to be controlled at the level of our hypothalamus there. This is also going to be the home of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is going to play a role in regulating circadian rhythm. So your body's clock essentially is saying that, okay, it's time to wake up or it's time to go to bed. You know, this is going to be all regulated by this suprachiasmatic nucleus, again, which is going to be that circadian rhythm, which resides, a suprachiasmatic nucleus residing in our hypothalamus. And it's also going to serve as the body's thermostat for temperature regulation. So, finally, on to the cerebrum, the big major star of the show kind of thing. This is what people think of when they think of the brain. So, on to the cerebrum. So, the cerebrum is going to be the largest of the parts of the brain. And this is going to be responsible for our higher order functions. The cerebral cortex is going to be the outermost layer of the brain, and it is going to be composed of gray matter. And this is going to contain billions with a B, of neurons. So tons and tons and tons packed in there. Now, the surface features that we see within the cerebrum are going to have these prominent ridges and grooves, right? So the ridges are called gyri, singular is going to be gyrus, and the grooves are going to be called sulci. So if we draw our like little wavy bit here, all right, our peaks are going to be our gyri, and our grooves are going to be our sulci. So we've got our gyri and our sulci, all right? Singular for sulci is going to be sulcus. Now, we also can have these deeper grooves, right? And these deeper grooves are known as fissures. A great example of this is going to be the longitudinal fissure that's going to separate our two, our right and our left hemispheres that we see there. This is going to be our lateral fissure. Now, deep to the cortex is going to be our white matter. And this is going to be composed of myelinated axon tracts. And this is, again, this myelination is going to contribute to this white kind of color. Again, because myelin is going to be a very lipid-dense sort of structure. And it's going to provide us with that kind of white color that we see with our white matter. Now, the corpus callosum is going to be a major play. This is this large bundle of white matter that we can see here, kind of circle that a little bit there, that is going to be these white matter tracts that are going to be responsible for connecting our right and our left hemispheres of the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum gets divided into 5 lobes, and they're pretty similar to the 5 bones of the 5 cranial bones. But we've got our frontal bone, right, or frontal lobe, excuse me. Our parietal lobe is going to be over here, in the middle here. Temporal lobe is going to be kind of on the side. You don't really see that one super well here. Occipital lobe is in the back. And then the insula is going to be deep to that lateral sulcus. It's kind of tucked up in there. So, the cerebrum, cerebral white matter, and specifically we're going to talk about the basal nuclei. Now, the cerebral white matter is, again, like we said, it's going to consist of these myelinated axons that get organized into 3 types of tracts. We've got association tracts, commissural tracts, and projection tracts. Now, our association tracts are going to connect areas within the same hemisphere. Commissural tracts are going to connect corresponding areas between hemispheres. A great example of this is going to be the corpus callosum. Again, those white matter tracts that are connecting corresponding regions between our 2 hemispheres of the brain. And then our projection tracts are going to be responsible for connecting the cerebrum to other parts of the brain and spinal cord. All right, so those are our three types of tracts. Now, also within the cerebral white matter, we have our basal nuclei. This is also sometimes called the basal ganglia. Be aware of both. It's a potato-potato situation, right? But these are these paired masses of gray matter that are actually going to be buried deep down within the cerebral hemisphere, right? These masses of gray matter that we have are going to include the caudate nucleus. We can see this little guy right here, right? The putamen nucleus, we can see that there, as well as the globus, pallidus. Sorry. All of these are going to be components of our basal nuclei there. All right. The basal nuclei is going to be super important because this is going to help to initiate as well as terminate any sort of voluntary movements. So they are going to also suppress any sort of unwanted movement and help to regulate muscle tone. Now, when we have neurological disorders, things like Parkinson's or Huntington's, that impact specifically the basal nucleus. In Parkinson's disease, this is a disease classified or characterized by hypokinesia. All right, so hypo meaning low or below, so less movement, right? And Huntington's disease is hyperkinesia, meaning high or above, right? So these are going to be where you have either a reduction in movement or an excess of movement. And these are going to be these disorders that we see impacting the basal nuclei. On into the limbic system. This is another sort of critical portion, component that we see of the cerebrum. The limbic system is going to be this sort of ring of structures that we can see here in green. These are going to be found in this, the cerebral hemispheres, as well as in the diencephalon. Now, sometimes the limbic system gets called the emotional brain or the lizard brain. That's kind of a goofy name for it. They get called this, though, because they're going to play a primary role in emotions and behavior. So they are pretty important. Now, major components that we see of our limbic system are going to include the hippocampus, the amygdala, the cingulate gyrus, as well as portions of that hypothalamus. Now, the hippocampus is going to be super important for converting short-term memories into long-term memories. So Dory from Finding Nemo, right? She likely maybe had some kind of issue with her hippocampus because she could not convert her short-term memories into long-term memories. A little fish there. So that's going to be our hippocampus. All right. The amygdala is going to play the major role in fear response, as well as playing a role in aggression, as well as emotional memory. The cingulate gyrus is going to be involved in emotional processing and is also going to be important for helping to link behavior with sensory output. And overall, the limbic system is going to promote a very wide range of emotions. So it covers everything from pleasure to pain to fear, anger, affection, aggression. All of it is going to be, a lot of this is all going to be covered by our limbic system. But importantly, it is the connection that we see between the limbic system and our prefrontal cortex, right, that is going to allow for the sort of rational thought to influence our emotional response, so that we're not just purely creatures of emotion responding to our basic instincts and our purely emotional responses. We're able to have some sense of logic and rationale to our responses. So this is going to be kind of an important kind of connection there, allowing us to respond like adults, not like 3-year-olds. Obviously, little kids are working on this connection, as they sometimes are purely emotional little creatures. So, on to the cerebral cortex. This is, I feel like, what most people think of when they think of the brain. They're thinking generally of the cerebral cortex. Now, specific types of sensory, motor, and integrative signals are going to be processed in distinct cortical regions. So there are specific regions that are used for the processing of sensory information or the processing of motor information, whatever the case may be. All right. So we're not just sort of mixing and matching it all together. Now, the primary motor areas that we see are going to be located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. All right, so we've got our parietal lobe is going to be this kind of region here. We have our central gyrus here, and this right here is going to be our primary motor area. So we're going to say motor. All right. This is going to control our voluntary movements of specific skeletal muscles. Broca's area is going to be super critical for speech, and it's typically found in the left frontal lobe. We can see this little guy's right here. This is Broca's area, and this is going to help to control muscles for speech production. All right. The primary somatosensory area is going to be in the post-central gyrus. So we've got our central sulcus that runs down the middle here, dividing line, and this is going to be our somatosensory area. All right. This is going to receive and interpret information, things like touch, pressure, pain, temperature, proprioception, all that good stuff is being sent to our somatosensory area where it's going to be processed. Now, our primary visual area is going to be located in the occipital lobe, and the primary auditory occipital lobe and the primary auditory areas are going to be found in the temporal lobe, which you can see there. Additionally, coming back to this idea of speech and language, right, we've also got Wernicke's area. This is going to be super important for, which we can see here, Wernicke's area. This is going to be critical for understanding spoken language as well as written language. So our ability to kind of understand and comprehend what's being said. So again, we've got our 5 lobes of the brain. We've got the frontal lobe. We've got our occipital lobe. There we go. We've got our, excuse me, our temporal lobe, our occipital lobe. I feel like I said that already. Oh, and then tucked in here is we're going to have our insula. All right. So, looking then at the hemispheric lateralization. This is super cool kind of concept. So obviously we have a left and a right. I got it right that time. A left and a right hemisphere to our brains. All right. So kind of looking at comparing and contrasting what we're seeing being controlled by the left versus the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is going to control muscles for the right side of the body, and likewise then, the right side is going to control muscles on the left side of the body. Left hemisphere is going to be responsible for things that are more involved with reasoning, sort of numerical interpretations, as well as scientific skills, where the right hemisphere tends to be more associated with sort of musical, creativity, artistic sort of awareness. Spoken and written language centers are going to be on the left hemisphere, where space and pattern perception are going to be in the right. Additionally, the ability to use and understand sign language is going to be kind of handled by our left hemisphere here, whereas recognition of faces and emotional expression are all going to be found on that right side. We find both Broca and Wernicke's areas typically located on the left hemisphere, as well as damage to the left hemisphere is going to be more likely to be associated with causing aphasia, which is going to be some sort of language impairment. Depending on whether the Broca's area or the Wernicke's area gets damaged is going to influence the type of aphasia that you have. So all of this is going to be on the left hemisphere, whereas the right hemisphere is going to be more involved with generating emotional sort of content in language. So while the left hemisphere is still responsible for the analytical and mathematical sort of aspects of language, of our spoken and written language centers, the emotional aspects that we see that we are able to insert into our language is going to be more dealt with on the right side, the right hemisphere. If we have damage to the right hemisphere, this is more commonly going to be associated with a sort of monotonous sort of tone of speech. So any sort of loss of inflection where we've lost that emotional content for that language. So overall, this is kind of a really, really cool sort of way to look at the differences that we see between what's being processed on that left versus right hemisphere of our brain, of our cerebral cortex, of our cerebellum. So very cool. So that's the last that we have of the various parts of the brain, but we do have to importantly discuss these cranial nerves. And these, if you're these are going to be particularly important. All right. So moving on to our cranial nerves. So broadly, we've got just a quick overview real quick. So we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that are going to emerge from the brain and are going to pass, through these little foramina that we have in the skull. We designate our cranial nerves with Roman numerals. All right, so we have 12 of them, so we have I through XII. All right, so if you need a refresher on how Roman numerals work, the Google is there to support you. All right, so these Roman numerals, we designate our cranial nerves, again, with our Roman numerals, but this is based on the order in which they're going to arise from the actual brain. So we can kind of get an idea of looking at the whole brain, maybe generally what neighborhood we're looking at as far as our cranial nerves. The cranial nerves can either be sensory, motor, or mixed, which means that they are going to contain both sensory and motor fibers. So I prefer the use of the term both as opposed to mixed because M is different than M, all right? So we've got S, M, and B, all right? Sensory, motor, or both, all right? Now, sensory nerves are going to carry impulses from receptor to the brain, all right? They are carrying things into the central nervous system, all right? Our motor nerves are going to carry impulses from the brain to various muscles or glands, so they are carrying things away from the central nervous system. And then our mixed, or our both, right, is going to have a mix of both types of fibers. So both ascending and descending type fibers are both our sensory and our motor fibers. Now, we've got our 12 cranial nerves, and there are a wide variety of mnemonics that are there to help you kind of remember the order of our cranial nerves. The classic one is O, to touch and feel very green vegetables. Now, that's a weird one for sure, but that is kind of the classic. Obviously, there are more out there. If there's one that's easier for you to remember, if you're like me and you need things to be a little bit rude to help with the remembering process, I'm sure that you can find plenty of other options. But overall, we've got our 12 cranial nerves are going to be our olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, transducens, facial, vestibulocochlear. That's a combo one. It's a crazy one. As well as glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. That is all 12 of them, all right? And they are going to be arranged in this silly little mnemonic that we see here for your studying delights. All right, so starting with some cranial nerves, we're going to start with cranial nerve 1 and 2. Cranial nerve 1 is going to be the optic nerve, all right? And these are going to be associated with the special sensory nerves that are obviously going to be for our sense of smell, because olfaction, it means is going to be our sense of smell, all right? So our olfactory nerve is involved with olfaction. That makes sense. Now, the axons that are going to pass through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone and are going to reach the olfactory bulb where they're going to synapse. We will talk about this whole process more when we get to the special senses lecture. Now, the optic nerve is going to be our cranial nerve 2. And this is going to be another special sensory nerve that is going to be optic, right? So it's going to be involved with our sense of vision, sight, right? And so the axons that we have for our optic nerve 2, our optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, are going to be axons that we have from that retinal ganglion cells. They're going to form the optic nerve, and these are then going to partially cross at our optic chiasm, which we can see here, partially crossing there, our optic chiasm. And again, we'll talk more in depth about this whole crossing over situation in our special senses lectures. So our next cranial nerve is going to be the oculomotor nerve, which conveniently is cranial nerve 3. These are going to be motor nerves, all right? And these are going to control the extrinsic eyeball muscles that are going to be responsible for helping to move your eyeballs every which way. So we have somatic motors, neurons that are going to help to move the eyeball. This is going to be the superior, inferior, and medial reticulus, as well as the inferior oblique, which is going to help to raise the upper eyelid. And then our autonomic motor neurons are going to help to are going to constrict that pupil, and are also going to adjust the lens to help accommodate for different vision, like closeness of vision, so near versus far away. All right, so this one is going to be motor, whereas our first two here, our olfactory and optic, are going to both be sensory. So we then have our trochlear nerve. This is another motor nerve, all right? Another motor cranial nerve. This is cranial nerve 4 in case. So IV is 4 in case you're needing a refresher on your Roman numerals there. But this is a motor neuron, a motor nerve that is going to innervate the superior oblique muscles of the eye. So this is again going to play a role in helping to move the eyeball every which way. All right, and then the abducens is another motor nerve that we see here, and this is going to innervate the lateral reticulus muscle of the eye. So these three all together, the oculomotor, the trochlear, and the abducens, are all going to play a role in sort of regulating muscles that are responsible for moving the eyeball. All right, so all very important things, or just associated with, I guess, also different aspects of vision, like this, pupil constriction, as well as lens adjustment accommodation. So all of these three are going to be associated with the eyeball in one way or another. We then have our trigeminal nerve, which is cranial nerve 5, in case you're, again, needing a reminder. Trigeminal. This is going to be the largest of our cranial nerves, and this is going to be a mix. So this is going to have both sensory and motor. And there are 3 branches associated with our trigeminal nerve. All right, we've got our ophthalmic, our maxillary, and our mandibular divisions. All right, so we can see that kind of illustrated right there, this guy right here. All right, so because this is both, right, it's going to have both sensory and motor tracts. So our sensory tracts are going to be involved with detecting things, sending input for things like touch, pain, temperature. They're all coming from the face, the scalp, and the oral cavity. All right, and the motor tract are going to be responsible for controlling the muscles of mastication, aka chewing. So this is our first mixed nerve there that is going to have both. All right, Facial nerve is going to be, the facial nerve is cranial nerve 7. This is another one that's going to be, that's going to have both, all right? This is going to have both sensory and motor tracts, all right? And this also has a very extensive sort of distribution, all right? So here we've got our facial nerve diagram. This is going to have, again, mixed, so it is going to have sensory and motor tracts. The sensory tracts are going to be responsible for sending input about taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, whereas the motor tract is going to control facial muscles of the various facial expressions, as well as the autonomic motor stimulation of for the secretion of things like tears and saliva from the salivary glands. All right. And then we have cranial nerve 8. All right, so we've got 7 up here, 8. This is going to be our vestibulocochlear nerve. This is another one of our special senses sort of nerves, and so this is going to be a sensory nerve. And it has 2 main branches. We have the vestibular tract and the cochlear tract, right? Or the vestibular branch and the cochlear branch. So vestibular branch is going to be involved with equilibrium, whereas the cochlear branch is going to be involved with hearing. And again, we will talk ad nauseum about the old vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8, when we get to special senses. We've got a whole hour on it, so just hold your horses there. We also, then for our next of the cranial nerves, we have the glossopharyngeal nerve, all right? This is cranial nerve 9, all right? This is going to be another one that's mixed. This is going to have both sensory and motor tracts, all right? But this is going to serve the tongue and the pharynx. Now, the sensory tract is going to be responsible for sending in information of taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and it's also going to be monitoring blood pressure and blood gas. So kind of a weird combo there for sure, but very important. And then the motor tract is going to play a role in swallowing, and then the autonomic motor sort of stimulation is going to be used to sort of regulate this parietal salivary gland secretions to help with the secretion of saliva, of drool, right? Then our vagus nerve is cranial nerve 10. All right, this is going to be the most widely distributed. This sucker goes all over the place of our cranial nerves. And this is another one that's mixed, so this is going to have both, all right, sensory and motor, okay? So for our sensory tract, this is going to monitor blood pressure, the blood gases, as well as sensations that are coming from the thoracic and the abdominal organs. All right, so this is clearly very widespread. The motor tract, on the other hand, is going to control swallowing, vocalization, and coughing, okay? So those are our kind of 2 breakdowns there. Now the autonomic motor that we're going to see here, or the autonomic sensations, autonomic motor control that we see with the vagus nerve is going to be important for regulating things like heart rate. This is going to cause a decrease in heart rate. It's also going to stimulate GI motility and secretions, which is helpful for like digestion and for like the gut motility, like moving foodstuffs through the GI tract. And it's also going to play a role in constricting airways. So, oops, dang it. All right, and then our last 2 cranial nerves, we've got our accessory nerve, which is cranial nerve, 11. The accessory nerve, this is going to be motor. All right, a motor nerve, and this is going to control the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscles. This is going to play a role in moving your head, as well as elevation of the pectoral girdle, so like lifting your shoulders. And then finally, last but not least, the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve 12, is going to also be motor nerve, another motor. This is going to control the tongue muscles for speech. It's also important for helping the tongue to to manipulate food, as well as playing a role in swallowing. So those are our 12 cranial nerves. These pictures are very useful to sort of get an idea of where is that cranial nerve sort of coming from, and what is it going to innervate, right? So here is just sort of a nice little table kind of thing that is useful to help break down our various the functional classifications of our various cranial nerves, with our sensory nerves versus our motor nerves versus the mixed or both, all right? There are mnemonics for this. Obviously, it says the big one is some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. That's going to kind of help you to remember the order of our sensory versus our motor. versus the both nerves there, the functional there. So that is all I have. There are some key concepts here, if that is just sort of there to sort of help summarize for you, as well as some terms and definitions. Again, all of that's included. It's just there if you kind of want to review it. And that's all I have for you. So I will hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next time.